Hi, everyone, and welcome to PRISM's webinar on special education. My name is Allison Stefanok, and I'll be your host. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us this evening. We are in extraordinary times, and connecting with each other through our virtual community is now more important than ever. So we appreciate you being here. We hope everyone is well and staying safe. This webinar is brought to you by PRISMS. PRISMS is an acronym for Parents and Researchers Interested in Smith-Magenis Syndrome. PRISMS is an advocacy, education, and support organization for individuals with SMS, their families, and the professionals who serve them. As always, a recording of this webinar, as well as past webinars and a listing of future webinars, can be found on prisms.org under the Education tab. Our topic for this evening is Special Education with Sylvia Farber. Sylvia is the owner and founder of OneonOne Advocacy. She holds a BA in Special Education and Elementary Education from Florida Southern College and a master's degree in Special Education from Florida State University. Sylvia has 10 years of experience in various special education settings, including working as a classroom teacher, a special education department head, and an alternative certification instructor. She's worked as an advocate helping families navigate the special education process since 2008. Sylvia is also a wonderful PRISMS volunteer and the mother of 3 children, one with SMS. If you have any questions for Sylvia during the webinar, you can type it into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. At the end of the presentation, we'll take some time to answer as many questions as we can. Our conference is currently planned to happen as scheduled. However, we're going to avoid any lengthy discussion or questions about applying for conference funding through the IEP process, given how quickly things are changing right now. I also know that there are a lot of unknowns right now with schools being closed. Sylvia is going to address this as best she can during her presentation, but there may be questions that she's unable to answer on that topic tonight as well. So Sylvia, thank you for making some last-minute adjustments in your presentation and adding information about the historic challenges that the education system is facing right now. I know that you have a lot to share with us this evening, so I will turn it over to you now.
Well, thank you so much for having me present tonight. And in looking at the difference of our 2 pictures, I wish that I had some sort of Zoom filter so that I look as good as you do. But anyways, I'll get over that in a second. So tonight, I will be talking about planning for next year and wrapping up this year, which is kind of a bizarre situation to be in because we are in very uncharted territory and unknown times, but the presentation is still going to be relevant. And I will start the presentation with just talking a little bit about what does COVID mean for schools. And so right now, FAPE, which is free appropriate public education, that is required. Schools still have to provide FAPE if they are providing services to non-disabled children. If a school was to completely close and not provide services to any child, then they wouldn't be required to provide services to disabled children. But if they are going to provide services to non-disabled, then they do have to provide services to our children as well. And so during the school closures, I have SMS in my house, so if you hear the background, I apologize for the noise. So during any school closures, the services that they provide should be comparable to the services that they're offering for non-disabled students. Those comparable services may not be appropriate for some students, or they might not even be provided for some students given the variety of needs that each individual student is going to have. Some services may not be able to be provided. Some services may just simply not be appropriate. And so if they're not provided or they're not appropriate, then that would mean the school is not providing FAPE. So they're not providing that free appropriate public education. And if that is the situation, then when school resumes, a conversation is going to need to be had regarding compensatory services and or potentially ESY services being necessary to make up for those services that weren't provided during the school closure. And so right now, the IEP meetings are likely still going to happen for most people if you have an annual coming due, or there's an evaluation coming due, or some other already scheduled meeting, or a meeting is going to be due sometime this spring. It's very likely that those meetings are going to happen. I've been participating in meetings I've had, I don't know, this week, I think I've already had 5 this week. So they are going through video conferencing. Most of them, some of them through phone conferencing, but video conferencing is how most of those meetings are proceeding. A district may decide to not provide any meetings until schools resume. I believe that states are going to have a lot of leeway, and districts are going to have a lot of leeway with how they meet compliance deadlines. So that's why it's going to be very hard to talk specific to any particular situation or any particular state, because I think everyone's going to interpret their requirements differently, and a lot of leeway is going to be given regarding requirements. But just know that a free appropriate public education is required if they're providing services to non-disabled children. And if your child doesn't receive those appropriately, then your child may be entitled to compensatory services when school resumes. And then the last thing I want to say about this is really give yourself a break. This is not easy times. Don't stress yourself out trying to provide all this academic instruction that teachers and related service personnel are providing. Right now, relationships are very important, and your relationship should be more important than the academic instruction. So really give yourself some slack. Don't stress over this, and just know that you're not going to be able to provide the same services that 5 other people or more than 5 people are currently providing for your child during the school year. So there's no way that you're going to be able to be everything to your child that everyone else was already doing for your child while at school. So give yourself a break. Don't stress about it. It'll be okay. And when the school resumes, you can talk about what services weren't provided and how to make up those services. All right, so I think that's all I have to say about that. It's just unknown times. There really isn't a lot more to say, and every state's going to interpret it differently. So going to the normally scheduled programming now. So the best thing that you can do for your child in preparing for their education now and the education in the future is really to educate yourself. Know what the purpose of IDEA is. The purpose of IDEA, a lot of people think, and a lot of education just says that they want to focus just on academics. But the purpose of IDEA is more than just academics. It's also to prepare for future employment and future independence. And so just kind of memorize that line. What is the purpose of IDEA? Is to prepare the student for future and further education, employment, and independent living. Sorry, I just had to send my husband a message to say, take my daughter outside because he is distracting me so much by her being in the house pitching a fit right now. So I'm glad I'm talking to SMS people right now who will get the life that I'm leading right now. So the other thing you need to do is read the procedural safeguards. So every year you get your procedural safeguards, and a lot of families really don't pay any attention to those procedural safeguards and have never even read the procedural safeguards, but it is something that you really do need to know, because that's the meat and potatoes of what the school district is required to provide to your child. And if you are educated on the procedural safeguards, you will know a vast majority more than many other parents know about what the rights and responsibilities are, what the rights of the parents are, and what the responsibilities of the school districts are. So please read that procedural safeguards and be familiar with that. The other thing for education's sake is to visit Rights Law. Wright's Law is the single best place to get information on special education law. There really isn't a better website or a better resource for families. So anytime you have a question about anything special education law related, you can visit wrightslaw.com. They've got a wonderful search engine there, and you should be able to come up with a wealth of information from that website alone. Okay, so we're not going to spend a lot of time here as well with the PRISM's conference attendance. Just know that parent training is a related service, and that if a parent needs more information to better understand their child's disability or how to support their child, then they can get parent training. And attending the PRISM's conference would be one way to obtain parent training. And the school district can pay for a parent to attend the PRISM conference by parent training. And so even through all these school closures, the IEP team can still meet and they can still address this request. And so right now the PRISM's conference is still planning to be held. And if you want to be attending the PRISM conference and you need help with attendance there, then please ask your IEP team for support with conference registration fees. They can also help pay for travel or hotel costs, but you really do need to be reasonable with your request. So if you can pay for some of that, then pay for some of it. But if you need help with all of it, then ask for help for all of it. But just be reasonable with your request and know that anytime a parent needs additional information about a child's disability or additional information to help a child meet their needs, parent training is something that a parent can request, whether that's attending the PRISM's conference or whether that's attending a different conference, something maybe with behavior. Sometimes PRISMs and autism are together, and so maybe attending that kind of conference would be helpful for a family. So anytime a family needs additional information, you can ask for that under the parent training as a related service. Extended school year services. This is probably going to be a big one this year, especially with the school closures. And so typically extended school year services are for students who have regression of their skills during a break and they're not able to recoup or recover those skills. So the regression model is the single biggest model that the school district likes to use to try to justify whether a student is entitled to ESY services or not. But there are some other areas that the school district can consider whether the child needs ESY services, and that's emerging skills. So if there is a skill that is emerging, so like if toileting is a skill that's emerging, or there's a behavior skill that's emerging, or even a social skill that's emerging, and if services weren't provided, then that skill could disappear and we'd have to start over again, then that's another way to justify having extended school year services. The other one would be the potential need for more restrictive placement. So if the child is currently in a general education classroom or in some resource classes, but not all resource classes, or they're in some special ed classes, but they still have some general education classes. And if the services were to stop, and the student may then, when they started school again, be in a more restrictive placement, which means more special education, then that's another way to justify that the student may need extended school year services, because if we didn't provide these services, then the student may need a more restrictive placement upon returning to school or shortly after returning to school. Extended school year services can include related services, so services like speech therapy, services like occupational therapy. Those services can be included as part of extended school year services. Sometimes they like to just look at the academic skills, but just know that related services can also be provided as far as ESY services go. So with the school closures that are happening now, ESY services may be something that becomes more of a need for students because they're not receiving the services that they are receiving right now, and therefore there's going to be more regression, or there's going to be a potential more restrictive environment because they haven't been receiving these services thus far. And so it just becomes definitely a more relevant conversation to have given the light of these school closures. Something else, and I don't remember if my slides talk about it in the future slides, so I'm going to address it right now, is something called compensatory services. And so again, that becomes very relevant right now for these school closures, that if the school is not able to provide the free appropriate public education for all services, for some services, then compensatory services could be due to the child as well. And so compensatory services are when a school district fails to provide the services that were agreed to in the IEP, then they are due to make up for those services. And so that's what compensatory services are, is the services that the child didn't receive, that they were entitled to receive and should have received, but didn't. And so the school district may be required to provide compensatory services for a student. So ESY services and compensatory services are going to be hot topics as the school year ends, if school resumes, and even into next year as well, because compensatory services aren't going to be hour for hour. So the student missed so many hours of math instruction. They're not going to be entitled to every single minute of the math instruction that was lost. Same thing for like speech therapy. If they missed, 9 sessions of speech therapy, they're not going to be entitled to every hour, minute to minute for the sessions that they've lost, but they would be entitled to services that were lost. And there isn't a magic formula. There isn't a specified formula for how do you figure out what that time is, but it really is just figured out between the district and the parent as far as what does that look like for how much services the student should receive to make up for those services that were lost. Again, it's not minute to minute. There is no formula for providing that out. You just kind of have to work together to figure that out. So FBAs, functional behavioral assessments, and behavior intervention plans. These two are very big factors for most of our kids with SMS because behavior is so impacted with our students typically. So inappropriate disruptive behavior is typically the biggest reason for removal from the John Education classroom. And it also, behavior limits a student's future ability for employment and also the future living situation that the student would be able to access. Behavior can impede employment and future living situations. So when behavior is an issue, which it likely is an issue, you really need to be requesting a functional behavior assessment. And a functional behavior assessment can be requested at any time, and it should be done by someone who has an expertise in behavior. So in the more recently, FBAs are starting, a trend is being completed by someone who is has more authority in behavior. In the past, a lot of teachers were completing FBAs, and that's not to say that that's wrong, but when you have significant maladaptive behavior, you really need someone that's an expert in behavior to be completing these assessments and to be writing recommendations and helping a family and helping the campus move forward with how to implement a plan to deal with these very serious maladaptive behaviors. So you really need to make sure that your FBAs are completed by someone that is an expert, a behavior specialist, an autism specialist. Those usually are considered the experts in the school area. there's something called a board certified behavior analysis, a BCBA. Some districts are employing those, not all districts are employing those, but those would be another expert. If the school district performs an FBA and it doesn't really get the behavior, doesn't result in the behavior change that's necessary, you can request an IEE, and an IEE is an independent education evaluation. And an IEE is due to the family anytime the parent disagrees with an evaluation. So an FBA is an evaluation. And so if you were to not get the results that you felt were necessary or needed, then you can say this evaluation wasn't appropriate. I would like to request an independent evaluation. And an independent evaluation is when a private third party does an evaluation at school district's expense. And so typically what happens here is the school district will provide you with a list of providers, and then those providers are going to be light credentialed. And so you can't just have any Joe Smith complete an IEE. It has to be somebody who is light credentialed given the type of evaluation that was provided. And so if an LSSP completed the evaluation, then it would need to be somebody who is light credentialed like that. And the school district will give you a list of people who are light credentialed that meets the requirements to do an independent evaluation. However, if you want to use someone that's not on that list, you're certainly entitled to do so. It would just the district would have to work with that provider to make sure that they're light credentialed and work out the contract in order for that provider to be paid. So an IE, again, anytime you disagree with an evaluation result, or in this case, the evaluation isn't giving you the results that you feel are necessary, then you can say, I disagree with that evaluation. I want to request an independent education evaluation in the area of, in this situation, it would be in the area of behavior for the FBA. If you don't already have On the Road to Success, the guidebook for schools, I cannot strongly encourage you enough to get that resource. That resource is very, very helpful, and it's a great tool to help the schools understand how to address an SMS child's behavior. SMS behavior, as you know, is very different than a lot of other behavior from other students that have disabilities. Students with SMS, they have more maladaptive behaviors than other disabilities that have that have developmental delay. And there really are very unique and prescriptive ways for dealing with the behavior for students with SMS, and the Road to Success is a valuable tool to helping other teachers, to helping other providers understand how to best manage the student's behavior with SMS. That one factor being the antecedent manipulation is the key. A lot of traditional behavioral approaches like to focus on consequences as being how you deal with behavior. Usually for the SMS child, the consequence approach doesn't work, and you have to focus on the antecedent approach, the antecedent manipulation to get behavioral change, and not on the consequence approach to get behavioral change. So it's kind of looking at behavior in a different way, and traditionally people like to look at behavior in the consequence approach way, where for SMS, typically you need to look at behavior in the antecedent manipulation way. So again, if you don't have that resource, please get that resource. It can be valuable for you and the staff that works with your child. Least restrictive environment. Least restrictive environment is the general education classroom. So, excuse me. So when you hear least restrictive environment, or LRE, that is synonymous for the general education classroom. IDA, that's the law that governs special education. They strongly favor the general education classroom as the first placement option for students. Before a student is removed from general education, All supplementary aids and services have to be deemed unsuccessful in the general education classroom before a student should be removed. So all supports and services should be exhausted in general education first before removal from general education is considered. That's how LRE works. All supports and services should be exhausted first before we consider removing a kid from general education. LRE is a right, it's not a privilege. Sometimes people look at the general education classroom as something that you have to earn. That really is not appropriate. A lot of times that's the way they make families feel, though, is that you have to earn the right to be in general education, but it's a right that's governed by IDEA and not a privilege that you have to earn. And having support in the general education classroom is not restrictive. And so sometimes school districts will say, well, having a one-on-one is the most restrictive thing that a student can have. And that really is not accurate. LRE is the general education classroom. And general education classroom, all supports and services have to be exhausted before you look at removing the child to a more restrictive placement. Well, a one-on-one is a support that can be provided in the general education classroom and should be considered and used prior to removal to a more restrictive placement. So if someone says, well, a one-on-one is the most restrictive placement, that's not accurate. A one-on-one, first of all, is not a placement. A one-on-one is a support. And so it would be inappropriate to say that's the most restrictive placement to use a one-on-one, because a one-on-one is not a placement. It's a support that should be used and determined to be not effective before removing to a more restrictive placement. Even the Americans with Disabilities Act talks about independence and says independence is not measured by the number of tasks we can do without assistance. It's by the quality of life we can lead with assistance. So a student with SMS may need assistance for the rest of their life in a variety of areas, including academics, but that doesn't mean that that student, because they need assistance, they're not able to access the general education classroom. I don't have corona, I have allergies. It's a bad season, a bad time to have bad allergies right now, though. So goals and objectives. Goals and objectives are critical pieces for trying to program for your child. They have to be individualized a lot of times, especially with standards-based IEPs. And so school districts are required to have a standards-based IEP. And a standards-based IEP takes the curriculum. I don't know whether your state's using core or in our states we call them the TEKS. It's the, but that's the standards that all students are expected to learn. And the standards-based IEP means that you take those standards that all students are expected to learn and you figure out what standards are critical skills that your SMS student needs. And then how can we take that critical skill and individualize it in such a way that your student's able to make progress. They should not be a copy and paste of the standards. And so a lot of times we just see, in my line of work, I see that they just, click, 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 click. We want the student to work on these standards and they just copy and paste those into this program. And they're the same exact standards that every student needs to work on. And it's not appropriate to just copy and paste the standards into the IEP. The IEP is an individualized document. So what do we need to do? Even if we've identified this is a critical need or critical area for the student, what do we need to do to individualize that for this particular student? You need to know that goals drive placement. So when you're having the conversation about goals, they drive the future conversation about placement. You should never have a placement conversation before you have the goals developed. Goals should be developed before you have a placement conversation. And you need to know that life skills goals and functional goals, those support a more restrictive placement, a special education placement, and academic goals support the least restrictive placement, which is general education placement. For instance, if you have a 4th grader who is still needing assistance with toileting, I'm not saying it's inappropriate to have a toileting goal. You just need to know that if you do have a toileting goal, that's going to support a more restrictive placement, because 4th graders aren't working on toileting. And so where are they going to work on toileting? The only place they can work on toileting would be in a special education placement. So if toileting is necessary and you want your IEP to address that, you just need to know that that's going to support some special education time. If you feel like toileting is a necessary skill for your child to work on, but you don't want a more restrictive placement, then you can still have a toileting schedule put in place. You can do accommodations for toileting, but not have a goal, and then have your goals be academic goals, which support the general education placement. Again, I'm not saying that it's right or wrong to have goals that are life skills or functional skills, or an IEP that's heavy on academics. What I am saying, though, is that you need to know going into it that life skills and functional goals support special education placement, and academic goals support the general education placement, because you're going to develop these goals, and after these goals are developed, then you have the placement conversation about where are we going to be able to implement these goals. So this is a reading comprehension goal. Where are we going to implement this goal? Can that goal be implemented in general education? If it can, then general education should be the placement. If it can't, then special education would be the placement. But the goals are developed first, and then you have the conversation about placement. Your goals do need to be very measurable and specific. Words like understand and learn, those are not measurable and specific. I cannot see if you understand it, but I can see if you can solve the problem. I can see if you can locate information. I can see verbs. And so that's what it needs to be: action verbs that you can see, that you can measure. And so when you're looking at your goals and objectives, make sure that those words are action things that you can see, that we could see the student doing the skill. We can see the student solve 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication. We can see that the student identified 40 sight words. We can see that, we can measure that. And so make sure they have words like that and not words like understand or learn. The goals and objectives are important because that is the meat and potatoes of the programming. That's what your child is responsible for learning. That's what they're going to have progress measured by. And the progress is going to be reported to you on the IEP Progress Report. Very, very often I see IEP Progress Reports that tell me nothing about a student's progress towards their individual goals. So the IEP Progress Report should tell you very specifically about the specific progress for each goal. So if the student has that identify 40 sight words goal, the IEP Progress Report should say the student has identified 28 sight words this progress report, or the student has identified 70% of the 40 words during this reporting period. It should not say students making good progress, or the student's trying really hard or working really hard. Those type of things are not data-driven information. You need data-driven information for how the student is progressing on that individual goal. So make sure that it's something that you can, if you write the goal in a way that it's a measurable word, then it makes it easier for them to be able to show you measurable data on how the student is progressing towards that goal. So you should get an IEP progress report every time there's a report card. So every time you get that report card, you should look for that IEP progress report and look at it to make sure it has data-driven information in it. If it doesn't, I would send it back to them and say, please update this IEP progress report so that it has data-driven information on how the student progressed on each individual goal. If you get into a situation to where you're not sure if they're actually implementing the IEPs or if they're actually collecting data on the IEPs, you can ask for the data collection. They're required to do this. This isn't something that's a suggestion. Those IEP goals are required to be implemented. And there's supposed to be data collected on how it's going for the student in making progress towards that goal. And so if you have concerns about that, you can certainly ask for the data regarding the goals that your student has. So some other related services, it's pretty common that students are receiving occupational therapy, speech therapy, but some other related services that aren't as common is music therapy. So some of our students are very musically inclined, and they may make more progress towards our goals and objectives if they had music therapy. If you think that's something that your child might, benefit from, then you can ask for an evaluation for music therapy. Counseling services, and counseling services is not the school counselor. Counseling services is by a counselor. Sometimes it's by the licensed school psychologist, but it's by a licensed counselor, not just the school counselor. So if your student needs services to help with behavior or to counseling services may be appropriate. And so you can ask for an evaluation for counseling services. Teacher training. If a teacher needs more education to know how to meet your child's needs, teacher training can be requested as part of the IEP as well. Your teachers can attend the PRISMS conference. That can be a required part of the IEP. It'll be honestly a long shot to make it a required part of the IEP, but it's definitely something that you can talk about. And right now there are scholarships for teachers to attend the PRISMS conference. So right now that application process is open. And so if you wanted to encourage your teacher to attend the PRISMS conference, I would strongly encourage them to apply for one of the scholarships right now that the application process is open for. Ratios. So ratios are a key piece that isn't commonly addressed. But if your student needs a smaller ratio than what the current classroom setup is providing, then the IEP can dictate that your student needs a 1-to-3 ratio, a 1-to-5 ratio, a 1-to-10 ratio. Whatever that ratio is necessary for your student to make academic, behavior, and social progress, you can have the ratios be specified for your student. If your student needs a 1-to-1, that's another ratio that can be specified. So anytime that the student's not able to make adequate progress given the current ratios that exist, the IEP committee can talk about and discuss a smaller ratio. That doesn't mean the student has to go to another classroom. It might mean that they have to hire more staff to come into that classroom so that they can satisfy a lower student to teacher ratio. I already mentioned Wright's Law as a resource. There is an additional resource of Coppa, which stands for the, what does that stand for? I always forget. The Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates. That's another great resource for helping to understand what your rights are as a parent and what the school district's responsibilities are as well. So those are the two best websites for understanding your rights and the school district's responsibilities. All right, so I think right now Allison is going to take over again.
Thank you so much, Sylvia. Yes, thank you for that fantastic information. You have such a wealth of knowledge in this area, and I really appreciate you sharing it with us this evening. Before we move on to the question and answer portion of our webinar, I have a short video to introduce you to Allison and Andy Letzo. Allison is the regional rep for Florida and a wonderful supporter of PRISMS, and I hope you enjoy meeting them this evening.
Hello to the SMS family out there.
Oh, yay.
Who are you, Andy?
Andy.
What's your last name?
Letzo.
Andy Letzo, and I'm Allison Letzo, and we live in. That's right. He loves to say our name over and over again. So we live in Tallahassee, Florida, and we're here with his dad and his younger brother Jack,
Yeah.
right? And we got your diagnosis about 6-7 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And we found PRISMs right away. As soon as we got home, what do? Is you start Googling Smith-Magenis syndrome. And what popped up was PRISMs. And I don't know what we would have done without PRISMs. It was a lifesaver to us. I think one of the things that I found the most helpful was being able to read some of the firsthand accounts from other parents, from other families. It really kind of confirmed all of our suspicions and the way that SMS kind of presents itself, where I always say you live in opposite world. And when I would try to explain it, look up, Andy. I know it's hot, just get one more minute. And when we would try to explain it to other people, they didn't quite understand, or how the behavioral techniques would work differently with it. So this kind of validated everything that we were feeling and experiencing with Andrew. So Andy, do you have any closing comments before we go? No? You're a man of few words today. You're hot. Okay. So I think we're about done with this video. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much, Alice and Andy, for that awesome video and for putting that together and sharing your story with us. I do know it's a very difficult time for you guys right now with the restrictions currently in place. Alice and Andy are not able to physically be together right now. So I just want you to know that we're thinking about you during this crazy and difficult time. So now we have some time for Sylvia to answer a few questions for us. We may not be able to get to all of them tonight, but we will answer what we can. Sylvia, let's see, let me take a look here. The first question that I have for you are there basic SMS best practices for what to put in an IEP? Maybe age-based general guidance. I know every SMSer is achieving differently, but maybe a few core tips.
So, wow, that's not an easy question to answer because it is so individualized. But I think that really on the road to success, if you don't have that resource, you've got to get that resource in your hands. That resource is going to be valuable to you as a parent and valuable to the staff that works with your child. I think that would be the biggest resource to help you know what are the key kind of components to include. It does talk about behavior in that road book on the road to success. It talks a lot about the antecedent manipulation being a key piece over the consequence-based system. And so to me, the key pieces for the SMS child would be addressing the behavior, because that has the biggest long-term impact is the maladaptive behavior. So addressing the behavior and making sure that the behavior is being addressed appropriately, which is likely through the antecedent manipulation and not a consequence-based system. And the other thing, I know that a lot of ideas and thoughts on inclusion really are kind of family specific and family as far as what their ideas on inclusion are. But if a family thinks that inclusion is the best placement option for their child, I think you have to start inclusion early and then hold on to that idea of inclusion. If inclusion in the John Education classroom isn't what you think is appropriate for your child, then then that's not an issue that you have to address. But if that is something that is important to the individual family, then I think you have to make sure that you address that early on for your child. The earlier you support the child through inclusion, the more likely the child's going to have success through inclusion. It's going to be very hard to take an older child and then all of a sudden say, I want to do inclusion. It's going to be a harder transition that way. So if inclusion is important to the family, then start that early. But other than that, I would just say that the road to success is a critical, valuable resource for parents and staff.
Thanks, Sylvia. I totally agree. We have the Road to Success in Natalie's IEP as well, and it's a huge resource for all of her teachers.
So you can even require, so as part of teacher training, the Road Book to Success, part of teacher training, you can require the staff to read that book so that they can be familiar with the techniques and strategies within that book. So that can be a requirement as part of teacher training for in your child's IEP.
That's awesome. Thank you. Okay, so the next question is, one characteristic of SMS is the craving of adult attention. Is this made better if the child has an aide, or are they distracted by the adult?
So I think that's it's really hard to answer all these because every child's different. I mean, every SMS child's different. Every child with a disability is different. The reality of the situation is you want to have the child be as independent as possible. But then going back to, the belief that support doesn't mean that your student can't be independent. And so support doesn't limit your independence, but you want to strive to having the least amount of support as possible. But if the student needs the support, then the student needs the support. And so I wouldn't limit support based on some arbitrary, well, there's no support, down the road. Sometimes school districts will try to say, well, a one-on-one isn't going to be available in the future. Well, who knows what the future holds? If a one-on-one is necessary right now for the student to have success, then have a one-on-one right now. But adult attention can be very motivating for the child, so it can help that situation. But it also, on another hand, for some child can be very debilitating where the student can't function without it. So I don't know that there's a black and white answer for yes, one-to-one, no one-to-one, and how does that impact the adult attention. I think it's a very individualized thing for each child.
Thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, that is hard because I know all of our kids are so very different. Okay, so the last question for this evening, transitioning to a new school is hard on the teachers. How do I explain what to expect from an SMS kid?
I hate to sound like a broken record, but again, on the road to success, I don't think there's a more valuable resource out there to help a family and help the staff to know what to expect. I think that really is the best resource for a family in trying to prepare a staff member or a new campus for what's coming.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. So it looks like that is all the time that we have for questions today. Thank you again, Sylvia, so much. I hope that everyone learned as much as I did from tonight's presentation. Sylvia is such a valuable resource. We sincerely appreciate you and are grateful to have you with us tonight, especially because I know there's a lot going on for all of us, and including yourself. So I really appreciate you being here and preparing this presentation for us this evening. So be on the lookout for an email from me with a link to a survey, and please take some time to fill out that survey if you get a chance. We'd love to know how we did this evening. I hope to see you all at future PRISMS webinars, and please be sure to follow us on social media if you don't already, and to join PRISMS if you're not already a member. So membership is free now, and it's the best way to stay connected, which is, of course, especially important given our current situation now. So PRISMS is a nonprofit. All of our programs, including our webinar series, are fully funded by our generous donors. So if you're interested in supporting PRISMS and the programs that it provides families impacted by Smith-Magenis syndrome, please visit our website, prisms.org, and consider making a donation. So this concludes our webinar for this evening. I hope everyone has a great evening, and good night.